What actually makes someone a villain and what makes them an antihero? Because sometimes the only difference is how the story frames them. A few days ago, I watched Naja both 1 and 2, and it really got me thinking about villains and antiheroes in media. By definition, a villain is someone who opposes the protagonist and is often framed as the bad guy, whereas the antihero, by definition, is usually the flawed protagonist, is morally grey but still followed by the story. But in practice, the difference between the two can get really blurry. Firstly, framing matters more than actions. The same behavior from characters can feel different depending on the POV, because it is the story that decides who we follow and whose thoughts we understand. In Naja, the main character, Naja, is feared by people and labeled as a threat, but we as the audience see his perspective, so we sympathize. We also see another character, Shangang Bao, who is painted or set up to be the villain in the first movie, but in the second movie, they show us more of his perspective, and so we sympathize. If his perspective was never shown to us, we would have continued to see him as a main villain, acting out of nothing but jealousy. Villains are often driven by their desire for control, destruction, and they often hold an ideology that we as the audience, as well as the heroes within the story, usually disagree with. Antiheroes are driven by the desire for survival, or finding their identity, or belonging, or place in this world, and usually hold an ideology that may hurt other people, but we as the audience understand. For example, in Naja, we see that his actions are chaotic and destructive at times, but his core motivations lie in wanting acceptance and struggling against how others see him. With Shangang Bao, his actions are horrible and out of jealousy and feelings of being undervalued, but his core motivations lie in setting up a better life for his loved ones and being seen as valuable and not just a pawn. So the reason that we root for antiheroes is because we understand their internal conflict. They feel more human to us in a way. We relate to them in a way because we see their struggle. That's why characters like Naja don't feel like villains, even when they act like one sometimes. And it's also why we can sympathize with characters like Shangang Bao. So why are villains still appealing sometimes? I think it's because sometimes we still sympathize with the villain, even if they aren't framed to be sympathized with. Because at the end of the day, us as the audience, us as viewers, we can make our own discernments and interpretations of characters and their actions if we are given enough information about them that humanizes them in a way, even just a little bit. But even without all of that, sometimes we still like the villain. And that is usually because of the character's confidence, power, clarity, and the way that they act without hesitation. Sometimes they're more entertaining or interesting than the heroes within the story. And sometimes we understand why characters choose to remain villains. And sometimes the characters who choose to remain villains in the story, like some villainesses in villainous manhwa genre area, we like seeing it because we understand them, we see where they're coming from, and we feel for them. But we also like seeing other characters like Naja, for example, fight against the label of villain or demon in Naja's case. Sometimes we see characters who sit in between the line of antihero and villain. Because sometimes we see antiheroes becoming villains and villains being reframed as antiheroes. But that is where things get interesting. Because villain versus antihero isn't a strict category. It always depends on perspective, motivation, and framing, and sometimes your own interpretation of the character. So sometimes the only difference between a villain and an antihero is who gets to tell the story, and maybe how we choose to listen to them.